walking down the road away from Abilene, where things aren't always what they seem. The jeans are dirty and the boots are
I had a conversation last night with a gentleman who's a mail carrier, and he's not just an ordinary mail carrier. He's one of these people that delivers mail out in the country, a rural mail carrier. And the conversation started out with us discussing how when these countryside mail carriers are on their routes, that in the month of July, the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources and Wildlife volunteers them and enlists their help in the annual rabbit and quail count. And we talked some, and he told me about how he'd be driving along and he'd scare up a quail or see a couple of rabbits run across the road, and how he'd make note of it and then proceed to turn it into the Department of Wildlife. And conversation took an unusual turn when he started to tell me about some of the other things that he had seen. One day he was driving along and he saw a large, furry, long-tailed cat, somewhat in the darkness, but in the bushes. You could see it, but maybe not see it totally like you would want to. And it was carrying something big. And he'd made the comments about this giant, big house cat type cat with some sort of prey in its mouth to a couple of the other mail carriers, and they said, well, it was probably a bobcat. The problem with that is bobcats have very short tails. And we both, myself and the mail carrier, were in agreement to that. And his mail route is on the very north end of Warren County, up towards the cave counties and the caves, not too far from Mammoth Cave. And when I was up there visiting this summer, I discovered in a roundabout way, because it seemed like people really didn't want to talk about it, but there was a man, and there still is a man, that roams Mammoth Cave in search of the Mammoth Cave cougar. He has even taken plaster castings of the cougar's paw prints. So, very interesting. This rural mail carrier up in that area of the country, seeing something like this. And what was even more remarkable, he told me, was that on his route, he has several farmers and people that raise goats, sheep, chickens, and cows. And he'd commented to me that several times a year, people would mention to him that, hey, let me tell you something. We went out to feed the goats last night, and we found one of them just slashed to ribbons over next to the barbed wire fence. Or, we think we're missing a couple chickens, and we're not sure what happened to them. But we know there's a rip in the chicken wire. So, unusual to say the least. True? Who knows? But, these wildcat stories have been around for a very long time. Even as far back as 1967, Bob Dylan wrote about them. In that song, All Along the Watchtower, he writes and sang, off in the distance I could hear a wildcat scream. So, there are the facts. You have a mail carrier, he delivers mail, He saw a large cat with a long tail. There's a man that has plaster casts of the cougar. And back to Bob Dylan. You know, Bob Dylan is still alive, and he wrote the lyrics to that song. I mean, that's a fact. And if you want to put more facts out there to go along with All Along the Watchtower, this area that we were discussing is very close to the Edmondson water tower. Now, what else could double as a watchtower other than something like a tall water tower? Your thoughts, send them back to me in the comment section.